Hello everybody, my name is Dan, this is MTG Tavern, and you are welcome. So much like me, I'm sure you guys love yourself a bloody ruddy good Sliver. After all, it is probably the most popular creature type in Magic, even if it is a bit shit in Modern. So many of you may also enjoy a prison deck. Well, what I've got for you today is a Decktech and 3 games, including Slivers and Prison. We're going to have Sliver Prison. So some quick things with this deck. First of all, there are no Aether Vials, there are no collected companies, which is already a very bizarre Slivers build because that is usually what you would include in a Sliver build. Another thing to note is, even though technically this deck is 5 colours, it's really just Simic, so a very budget mana base can be made for this one if you happen to own most of the pieces but don't want to invest in a Cavern of Souls. So before we get into the overall Prison plan, I will first do a very quick introduction to all the creatures, and then we will talk about how they all combo together to lock our opponents out of the game. So we're going to start with the 1-drops, and first of all, a non-Sliver is a Birds of Paradise. Now the key thing to remember with this deck is we do need to empty our hand very quickly. We kind of act like a really weird word prison deck where we're just casting a whole bunch of Slivers very early in the game. And Birds of Paradise really helps us to empty our hand very, very quickly. On top of that, later in the game when we're using most of our Slivers to tap down our opponent's permanents, we're instead wanting to use Birds of Paradise to do other things with our mana, which I will get to later on. We also have 3 Gale Rider Slivers, which, to be honest, the flying is irrelevant in this one. Think of this as our equivalent to an Ornithopter in Affinity. We're literally just casting this because it's a 1-drop that we can use to do other things later on in the game. And again, a reminder, we do need to make sure we empty our hand as quickly as possible. And finally, in our 1-drops, we have a 2-of Screeching Sliver. Now, for those of you who don't know what Screeching Sliver is, we tap a Sliver with this on the field, and we can mill our opponent for 1. Now, whilst that is also a win condition for us later on in the game, the key thing to remember again here is that in the early game, this is a 1-drop, so we can actually use it to do things which we'll get to in our 2-drops right now. Our 2-drops begin with 4 Gemhide Slivers and 4 Manaweth Slivers. Now, do you remember I said for the 1-drops we want to get them down because they can do other things going later into the game? Well, that begins as early as turn 2. That 1/1 flying Sliver we played on turn 1 with a Gemhide or a Manaweth Sliver suddenly turns into a Birds of Paradise, meaning that we can maybe cast 2-3 spells going into turn 3, and if we're lucky we can even cast a second spell on turn 2. We're also running 4 Diffusion Slivers. Now this is mainly to protect our creatures in the very early parts of the game. Having to make our opponents use 2 more mana to target one of our Slivers is actually quite a big deal. Usually in the main board, people don't run that many board wipes, so single target removal is going to be quite prevalent, so making your opponent pay an extra 2 mana for a 1 mana targeted removal spell is a huge deal in the early parts of the game. Our final 2-drop is a 1-of Darkheart Sliver. Now while this is very good against burn, it helps us to gain life when we're ready, that's actually not the main game plan of Darkheart Sliver here. I will come to that later on in the video, but just know that sacrificing our Slivers does more for us later in the game than just gaining us life. So now, moving on to the 3-drops, and our first creature is actually not a Sliver again, it is going to be Kira the Great Glass Spinner. Now the key thing to remember is that our Slivers are extremely fragile. When we go to the mid to late game, our opponent's going to have more than enough mana to kill out all of our Slivers for a Diffusion Sliver. Kira makes it so that our opponent has to target our Slivers twice with 2 targeted removal spells because the first one will be countered. Now while Kira herself is not actually a Sliver, so she cannot be used to produce mana or tap down our opponent's permanents, which we'll come to later on in the video, she is able to attack, which is actually again very relevant as we go later on to the video. That seems to be something I'm really saying a lot here. Maybe we should probably move to our 4-drops a bit quicker. Our only 2 Slivers in the 3-drops are a 1-of Frenetic Sliver, which is kind of another protection spell. We have a 50-50 chance if our opponent does target one of our Slivers, we can flip a coin. If we win the coin flip, the Sliver comes back on end step, and if we lose the coin flip, well, the Sliver was going to die anyway, so it doesn't matter. And again, much like Darkheart Sliver, the fact that we can remove a Sliver from the field is actually going to be relevant, again, going later on in the video. I'm really sorry that I keep saying that. The final 1-drop is a 1-of Necrotic Sliver, which is basically there that when we get to the mid to late game, we can start blowing up our opponent's permanents. And do you remember me saying that turning all of those 1-drops into then Mana Dorks and the Birds of Paradise, we use the mana for other things? Well, here is a prime example. We can make a Sliver, we can then blow up our opponent's lands, and then we can start slowly attacking with our very small creatures. So moving on to the 4-drops, and this is the part we've been waiting for. This is where most of the prison-y kind of stuff happens. We have a 3-of Telekinetic Sliver. Now, Telekinetic Sliver is our lock piece we really need to hold the game down. We can tap a Sliver to tap a permanent of our opponents. Now, this can be lands, creatures, Planeswalkers, I guess, if you really want to. So the key thing here is that if our opponent has an abundance of lands and not many cards in hand, we tap down their entire team. If our opponent has not much of a board but loads of lands, we tap down all of their lands. So our opponent is going to get locked very quickly with our telekinetic Sliver. The key thing with Slivers here is that we need to make sure that we have more Slivers on board than either A, our opponent has creatures, or B, our opponent has lands. And that, again, is why it's so important we empty our hand as quickly as possible. We get the mana producers on turn 2, which can produce mana for the telekinetic Sliver going into the mid to late game. And then all of those Slivers that were already on the field can start tapping down our opponent's lands straight away. And remember, once we've cast the telekinetic Sliver, we untap all of our lands next turn. Our opponent will never have mana again, but we get to untap lands every turn, so we can keep putting out another Sliver, and then another Sliver, and then another Sliver, and slowly we're going to keep tapping down our opponent's lands, until eventually we have way more Slivers than they have lands, and we start chipping in for points of damage. Our final 4-drop is a 2-of Dormant Sliver. Now, Dormant Sliver may feel like it's kind of a nombo with a Sliver deck. After all, giving our Slivers Defender means that they can't attack. Well, the key thing is that Defender doesn't stop you from tapping your Slivers to tap down your opponent's lands, and whenever another Sliver enters the battlefield, we can just draw another card, so we start slowly accruing card advantage. So while our opponent can't use their mana to do anything, we're drawing cards, adding more Slivers to the field, and when we're ready, we can just use that Dark Heart Sliver I was talking about earlier to sacrifice the Dormant Sliver and then attack with the team. We can also use the Frenetic Sliver to coin flip the Dormant Sliver, and whether we win or lose is irrelevant because the Dormant Sliver will not be on the field, because even if we win, it's exiled until the end step, so we can attack, our Dormant Sliver comes back, and we get to draw a card if it's worth anything whatsoever. So I actually forgot we do have one more Mesmeric Sliver in the 4-drop section, where we get to, whenever a Sliver enters the battlefield, we Fate Seal 1. So we look at the top card of our opponent's library. If we don't like it, we can put it to the bottom. Think of this as the Lantern control part of our Sliver combo. Finally finishing up our creature base with the 5-drops, there are just 2 of them. First of all, we have a Sliver Hive Lord. Now, Sliver Hive Lord, outside of stuff like a Path to Exile, basically means that all of our lock pieces now have indestructible, and it's very hard for us to lose the game. Our final Sliver, and a 1-of, is a Psionic Sliver. Now, this card can be great with a Sliver Hive Lord, but it can also be fine by itself. Remember, we are playing the Dormant Sliver, so we are not too bothered about attacking, so if we have a Sliver Hive Lord out, and we don't want to lock down our opponent's lands, instead, we can just start tapping our Slivers to deal 2 damage to our opponent, and the Sliver deals 3 damage to itself. However, we have Sliver Hive Lord out, so they cannot die to their own ability. However, if we get enough Slivers out, even if we don't have a Sliver Hive Lord, with just 10 Slivers we can sacrifice the entire team and kill our opponent in 1 turn. Now, we do have a few non-creature spells in this one. We have, first of all, a 1-of Ensnaring Bridge. Now, I didn't want to go too far down the Ensnaring Bridge route because our Slivers should be able to quite quickly tap down our opponent's permanents, but what Ensnaring Bridge allows us to do is if our opponent does put out a whole bunch of creatures, if we can put the bridge down, we can just use our Slivers to tap all of their lands and not worry about their creatures. Next up, we've got 4 Chord of Callings. Now, Chord of Calling is amazing in this deck because we're able, again, to empty our hand very quickly. We can then tutor up the lock piece we need. It's our equivalent of a Whir of Invention in a normal Artifact Prison deck. And you'll notice that actually some of the lock pieces, there aren't that many of them. So, for example, a Sliver Hive Lord is just a 1-of. Well, it's quite easy for us to just find the Sliver Hive Lord from our deck by just tapping our entire team and slapping that bad boy on the field. And finally, our last 2 cards in the deck are 2 Nissa Steward of Elements. Now remember, the key to this deck is to empty our hand reasonably quickly, so then we can start tapping down our opponent's permanents as quickly as possible as well. The issue with stuff like that is you then become a deck that top decks very early in the game, and Nissa alleviates some of that top decking by being able to scry 2 for us, playing a deck that wants to top deck the right card, not necessarily a whole bunch of cards. Her scry 2 also sets us up really nicely for a 0 when we can look at the top card of our library, and if it's a land or a creature, we can just slap it onto the field, and that's incredibly powerful in this deck. Now, Nissa's -6 is also extremely relevant to this deck, because you'll notice that Dormant Sliver says that all Slivers cannot attack. Doesn't say anything about Kira. Doesn't say anything about the lands we turn into 5/5s. So it's a way of us winning the game, even if we don't have the ability to win through our Sliver combos, we can just instead animate 2 5/5 lands, slap our opponent's face, see you later, bitch. So now moving on to the mana base, and this is actually quite important. Well, one specific land is very important in this deck. So first of all, I'm going to start with the boring-y kind of stuff. First of all, a 3-of Cavern of Souls. Now again, you'll notice that most of the creatures so far, outside of the odd exception, have been green or blue. So we don't have to have all of the Cavern of Souls, we don't have to have all of the unclaimed territories, we just need to have some Cavern of Souls to make sure that we can resolve our Slivers against counterspells. We've got a 2-off Field of Ruin. Our land base is that friendly that we can even slap in a couple of Field of Ruins, disrupt our opponent's mana base if they are like Tron or a greedy mana base. 3 forests, 2 islands, 4 misty rainforests, and 2 breeding pools. But now we talk about 4 Sliver hives, and you'll notice that we only have 3 Cavern of Souls, but 4 Sliver hives. And it's not for the ability to tap for any colour of mana to cast a Sliver spell, because we've kind of got that covered in our mana base anyway. It's actually the second ability, which is not really that good in a normal Sliver build, but in this Sliver build, being able to use all of our excess mana every end step to produce another Sliver is essentially like strip mining our opponent for 5 mana every single turn. So while we're using all of our Slivers to tap down all of our opponent's lands, we're using our lands to produce another Sliver, which again taps down another land of our opponent's next turn. So we can keep staying ahead. We have more Slivers than they have creatures or lands. So moving on to the sideboard, we have 2 Ensnaring Bridges for the creature matchups. We can get overrun very early in this deck if we don't get our lock pieces set up. 2 Damping Spheres because we can't really deal with combo decks with this one. 2 Harmonic Slivers for the artifact and enchantments, which we all love to hate. 2 more Dark Heart Slivers. Now these ones in the sideboard are there for the life gain, so if we are against burn, we bring in a couple of Dark Heart Slivers, which is going to be very powerful against them. It's not really there for the extra sacrifice outlets, although that will obviously help when needed. A 1 extra Frenetic Sliver when we're expecting very fast board wipes from our opponents. Now 2 Necrotic Slivers, they are mainly there for stuff that we can't really deal with. So for example, a Planeswalker, when we have Defender on our Slivers, a Planeswalker could take over the game for our opponents. So a Necrotic Sliver allows us to take out their Planeswalkers without having to attack them. 2 Shaper Sanctuary, these are here for matchups like Jeskai Control or a Death Shadow kind of build where they have a lot of targeted removal. And finally a 1-off Homing Sliver for when we need to tutor up a very specific Sliver from our library for the matchup intended. So that is Sliver Prison. I hope you guys enjoyed the deck tech. We're going to go ahead and look at the games that I played. Now I did have 6 tickets exactly in my MTGO account, so I gave myself 3 matches with Sliver Prison to impress me, otherwise it will go into the bin and never be talked of again. Now before we get into the games, I'd like to remind you guys to subscribe down below. Also, if you love me that much, you can support me on Patreon. And speaking of Patreon, thank you to Joshua Unthank, otherwise known as Mr. Zarakai, for the continued support, as well as Michael Osiris Center. Both love me so much that you help me out on Patreon. And if you guys haven't actually joined Patreon yet, you get access to exclusive videos every month for just $1 per month. Let's go watch those games. Our first match is against somebody who is playing a standard deck in Modern, and quite frankly it's quite a bad standard deck. Not that I'm any kind of expert on standard, but I think cards like you're seeing on screen right now wouldn't really do that well in standard, much less in a Modern format right now. Sure, we're playing kind of a meme deck in Sliver Prison, which taps down all their permanents, but that kind of still does enough to just absolutely annihilate them, and the game wasn't even remotely close. However, there was one massive highlight in this video, which is why I'm even referring to it, in that my opponent referred to me as a cheese dush by playing Slivers in Modern. Now, I don't really know what is meant by dush. I looked up on the interwebs what dush actually means, and apparently it is to punch or aggressively push something. So if I have offended anybody with my pushing of cheeses, pushing cheese upon you, punching cheese, using cheese to punch, I would like to apologise right now, and especially to my opponent, who seems to have some kind of affiliation between Slivers and the pushing of cheese. Now, since this was basically a non-match, instead I'm going to show you a different match at the end of the video where I play a test game against Blue-White Control. Now, the deck is slightly different in the Blue-White Control match, but still it's a very, very good match, and certainly better than watching a poor standard deck, which is even worse in Modern. Now in game 1 there isn't really much to talk about. We're on the play, but our opponent gets Tron on turn 3 with a Khan. That's the end of the game. There's nothing really for me to talk about in this one. However, there are 2 very good pieces of news for us in this matchup. One is that the Tron deck typically plays a lot of its spells, virtually all of them, at sorcery speed. The second piece of good news is that we have a reasonably decent sideboard against them. We have the Harmonic Slivers to destroy all of their artifacts. We also have Necrotic Slivers to start taking out their lands more permanently rather than just tapping them down. We take out the Dark Heart Sliver, it's not that relevant. Against Tron, the life gain is irrelevant. We bring in 2 Damping Spheres, again a very good card against Tron. We take out the Mesmeric Sliver. I don't really care about what they top deck again when we have the lock set up. They're not going to be able to cast anything they top deck. We take out some Diffusion Slivers. They're not really that good in this matchup. Our opponent doesn't really typically target most of our Slivers outside of a Walking Ballista. We start off with what can only be described as a god hand against Tron. We have our lands, our mana dorks, we have the harmonic sliver to take out their artifacts, we have our Chord of Calling to find the pieces we need to end the game, and we even have the damping sphere to really slow them down going into the mid game. We begin with a breeding pool, our opponent goes Ancient Stirrings, and they find themselves an expedition map. We find a Birds of Paradise, which would have been fantastic in our hand, but I guess we can't complain too much. Our hand is still very, very good. We put down the Gemhide Sliver, we pass to our opponent. They play the Mine, an Expedition map, and a Relic of Progenitus, a pretty useless card against us. We have no use for our graveyard. We top deck a second Harmonic Sliver, which may be a little redundant. We don't really need 2 copies of them, but I guess a spare one is still very nice. We cast the original Harmonic Sliver, we take out the Expedition map, and we're hoping that's going to slow our opponent down in time for us to get our Telekinetic Sliver out onto the field. Our opponent plays and cracks a Chromatic Sphere. They play a Power Plant and use the mana to crack their Relic of Progenitus. We top deck our basic island, which is actually a pretty decent draw. It allows us to play our Telekinetic Sliver and tap down a land this turn, so as long as our opponent doesn't have their last Tron land and an Oblivion Stone, life should be good for us. We use the Gemhide Sliver to tap down one of the Tron lands on their upkeep, and luckily for us there is no third Tron land, and even though they have the Oblivion Stone, that's no real issue. We can cast our Harmonic Sliver to take out the Oblivion Stone now, and I decided to play out a Birds of Paradise here rather than leaving up one extra sliver to tap down a land. The reason being is because we can tap down both of their Tron lands, and I'd like to have that extra mana going into the next turn to maybe get a Chord of Calling for our Sliver Hive Lord, and at that point the game is probably over. We stop on our opponent's upkeep, we tap down the Tron lands and leave them with just basic forests. Our opponent does nothing more than play a Scavenger Grounds and passes back to us. We top deck Akira, which actually isn't that good right now. I feel like our opponent's never going to be able to target our permanents anyway. I decide to go with the Nissa, Steward of Elements, instead of casting Chord of Calling. I think we have the game almost locked, and I think if we tap out for a Chord of Calling now for a Sliver Hive Lord, if our opponent top decks that last Tron land, they might be able to cast a Karn, an Ulamog, an Ugin, and then they can just win the game out of nowhere. By playing this way, we can cast our Akira, we can cast our Nissa, set up for a couple of turns, and our opponent's chances of winning are very, very slim. We scry with Nissa, we put a Sliver Hive on top, and then just above that we also put the extra Chord of Calling, so we're drawing a Chord of Calling next turn, then we can zero on Nissa to put the Sliver Hive into play. This also allows us to have 2 slivers up to tap down their 2 Tron lands for the next turn, so the worst case scenario is they play an Oblivion Stone, which they wouldn't even be able to use because we can chord for a Sliver to kill it straight away. We stop on our opponent's upkeep, we take down the Tron lands. Our opponent does indeed top deck their final Tron land, and luckily for us, the only thing they can cast is Wormcoil Engine, which is completely irrelevant. We top deck our Chord of Calling, which we knew about, we zero on Nissa to play our Sliver Hive, which we knew about, and I decide to pass the turn. I'm going to Chord of Calling on my opponent's upkeep so we can destroy the Wormcoil Engine and they don't get to attack with the tokens this turn. We begin with tapping down their Tron lands, and I actually decide to Chord of Calling from the Necrotic Sliver so we can permanently take out those lands on our opponent's side. I'm pretty confident our opponent is not going to be able to kill any of our Slivers this turn, and we can just Chord of Calling for the Sliver Hive Lord during our next turn. Our opponent does find the extra Tron land and they do cast an Oblivion Stone, but that may just be too late. We top deck into an island. I zero on Nissa in the hope of hitting a Sliver we can put onto the field, or a land. A land is a perfectly reasonable thing for us to find. We now have 1 extra mana for our Chord of Calling, meaning we can leave up even more Slivers for the next turn. I end up chording for a Dormant Sliver. Now, it's worth noting the correct move here is to go for the Sliver Hive Lord, I believe, but I'm just having too much fun absolutely wrecking Tron. I'm just going to enjoy this while I can. Unfortunately, our opponent just rage quits when we were about to sacrifice our first Sliver and take out a Tron land. Now, during our second sideboarding session here, I'm a little bit worried about my opponent bringing in stuff like Walking Ballista on the play, and we may never ever be able to stabilize any kind of board. So I do bring back in some Diffusion Slivers, I take out some of the Screeching Slivers, and I'm hoping that's going to be good enough to end up winning the game. I do feel like if we can get the lock set up, we just toy with our opponent, and there's not really much they can do. We keep an opening hand that is not amazing, but it's got lands, it's got slivers, it's got a key piece in the Telekinetic Sliver. We're going to keep. Our opponent does mulligan to 5, and they begin with a Tron land into a Chromatic Sphere. Now, if you think I'm going to give this Tron opponent any kind of sympathy, just because they mulligan to 5, you have another thing coming. You can go and fuck yourself. If you play Tron, you deserve no sympathy. I'm just glad that Jank Slivers is going to make your life miserable. We top deck into a Diffusion Sliver, which is a perfect top deck. We just need to avoid our opponent having natural Tron into an Oblivion Stone or something like an Ugin, and life should be great. Unfortunately, not for the first time, we top deck a Birds of Paradise at the exact wrong time. We begin with a Diffusion Sliver to make sure that none of our slivers can just be picked off by a Walking Ballista. Our opponent plays their second Tron land, and I'm starting to get that sinking feeling that my opponent's going to have natural Tron plus a Karn on a mulligan to 5. They crack the Chromatic Star, and they cast a Relic of Progenitus. I don't really understand why this is still in their deck. I'm guessing it's probably the least worst card they could leave in. So maybe it's just like an extra card that they don't really want, but there's just worse cards that are in their sideboard at the minute. They crack the Relic to draw themselves a card, and they pass back to us. We draw into a Dormant Sliver, which is a perfectly fine card. When we have our opponent tapped down with the Telekinetic Sliver, we're going to be able to draw a lot of cards with Dormant Sliver. We fetch for a Breeding Pool, we cast a Mana Weft and a Birds of Paradise, and this is probably our opponent's chance. If they can actually get Tron online now and win the game, then we probably just lose. If they don't, they probably lose themselves. Our opponent does indeed go ahead and cast the Walking Ballista, and thank fuck for Diffusion Sliver, otherwise we would probably lose this game from this position. However, our opponent does not play a third land, much less any kind of Tron land. We top deck a Mana Weft Sliver, not really the best top deck at the minute, but it's still a Sliver we can cast. We play a Sliver Hive and then cast a Telekinetic Sliver. We go to our opponent's upkeep, tap down both of their lands, and in response, they kill off the Diffusion Sliver with the floated mana using the Walking Ballista. Diffusion Sliver has already done its job though. It's protected our slivers for the key turn, and from here I feel like it's a matter of time until we have our opponent fully locked. Our opponent finds a land, but it's a Ghost Quarter, so not that scary. Speaking of lands, we find ourselves an Is land. We cast a Dormant Sliver to start accruing card advantage, and using the Birds of Paradise, we're able to put the Mana Weft Sliver down, and we draw ourselves into a rather lovely Damping Sphere. That is kind of our insurance policy should anything go wrong. We go to our opponent's upkeep, we try to tap down their lands. Unfortunately, our opponent rage quits. It seems like Tron players don't like it when their opponent toys with them. Our opponent goes AFK for about 5 to 10 minutes, MTGO then kicks in and boots them out of the game, and we take down Tron with janky Sliver Prison. I am so happy, I'm going to buy myself a Coca-Cola. I am hardcore. Our opening hand has 6 lands in it, and though one of them is a Sliver Hive, that's pretty much not the kind of hand we want to keep. Our other hand, though, has pretty much all the pieces we want. We have some protection, a turn 1 play, some lands, and a Chord of Calling to find the last lock piece we have. Most importantly, though, it has that really key Telekinetic Sliver in our hand. We play out our Screeching Sliver and pass to our opponent, who plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and it looks like we are against the Skred Red. We draw a Birds of Paradise for our turn, but I think it's way more important to get down this Diffusion Sliver to protect our slivers. If we are indeed against Skred Red, they have a lot of single target removal, and a Diffusion Sliver should buy us quite a few turns. Our opponent plays a Snow-Covered Forest and then casts into the north. What? So is this like a Skred Gruul list or something like that? I don't know. Our opponent gets a Highland Weld, which I didn't even know was a land that existed. We top deck into a Misty Rainforest, I fetch and shock, not because I'm really fucking stupid forgetting the fact we have a Breeding Pool out already, but because I'm definitely absolutely giving no fucks. Yeah. Feeling like a bit of a dumbass, I attack for 2 points of damage, and we pass to our opponent. The danger here is that our opponent now has the mana up to Lightning Bolt one of our slivers, and we might be in a bit of trouble. Luckily for us, they play a Tireless Tracker. They play their fetch land, and they pass to us. We top deck a Birds of Paradise, which is kind of okay. It's extra mana to pump into our Sliver Hive going later on into the game, but at this point, I think I'd rather draw into a lot more slivers to stop our opponent improving their board state. I cast the Telekinetic Sliver. We're going to leave up our slivers to tap down our opponent's creatures next turn, and life will be good. Our opponent fetches with the Wooded Foothills, they get themselves another land, and our opponent must love the snowy weather because yet again they go into the north. I guess our opponent thinks they are like some kind of White Walker off of Game of Thrones, and Tireless Tracker seems to think it's Jon Bloody Snow. They get themselves a 4th Clue token, which is absolutely fine by us. They can draw all the cards they like, as long as we can keep drawing slivers and keep their lands tapped down. Our opponent goes to combat, because I'm a complete fucking dumbass, I forgot to tap down the Tireless Tracker pre-combat. We now have to take 4 points of damage after they crack a clue when I could have completely avoided the situation. We top deck the perfect card in an untapped land. It means we can now Call of Calling for our rather lovely Sliver Hivelord. The Sliver Hivelord will be absolutely imperative because it will give all of our slivers indestructible. We cast the Birds of Paradise, which is basically a free spell when you have a Chord of Calling in your hand. We cast the chord, we get a Sliver Hivelord. Hey, that rhymes, let's keep going. Are you on board? Give me an award. This is awkward. Man, Snoopy the dog hasn't got shit on me. At this point, the lock is almost in. We need to find maybe a couple of more slivers to really take over the game. We're probably going to let our opponent have all the mana they like, and because we have the indestructible sliver down and we're against Skred red, and I assume they don't have any dismembers in their deck, our Sliver Hivelord basically makes it so all of our lock pieces cannot be destroyed in this matchup. We're going to use the Birds of Paradise mana to make a Sliver Hive token right down there. We're going to use our slivers after this turn to tap down all of our opponent's creatures so we can either attack their planeswalkers, attack their face, and they're never going to deal any points of damage outside of a lightning bolt. Our opponent does have this turn to make a meaningful impact on the board. Next turn, we're going to have all of our slivers up to tap down any permanents we would like. Well, that's pretty impactful. Luckily we can tap it down after this turn, but we're still going down to 6 points of life, and double lightning bolt isn't completely out of the question for our opponents. They get in for 4, they play a Scooze and pass to us. We draw a rather shit island. I decide to go ahead and try and erase them with a Sliver Hivelord. I'm going to make it so they can't actually deal any combat damage to us, but we're going to be able to start swinging with our Sliver Hivelord every turn. They block with the Scooze and we pass back to them. Our opponent cracks a clue and then casts Anger of the Gods. Now, while it's a little bit frustrating because we lose our Birds of Paradise, it's not the end of the world because our slivers are still alive. We float some mana, we make a sliver token, and then we tap down our opponent's team pre-combat. Our opponent plays another Wooded Foothills, they fetch for a land, and then they play themselves another Tireless Tracker. We tap down our opponent's entire team on end step to make sure our Sliver Hivelord can get in for some damage next turn. It's also worth noting that with our opponents taking 1 damage from their fetch land, they are now on a 3-turn clock just from the Sliver Hivelord alone. We top deck into our land, which is actually a fantastic draw, because now we have all of the lands available to make a Sliver token every turn, meaning our opponent's Anger of the Gods was pretty much useless last turn. We get in for 5 points of damage with the Sliver Hivelord, we make a Sliver token now, and we pass to our opponent. Our opponent cracks all of their clues, they get virtually nowhere, we tap down their entire team, and they realise they are kaput, they are dead, they are finished, they are deceased. They concede the game before we can get in the killing blow. Sliver Prison off to a fantastic start against what is usually quite an interactive deck. During sideboarding, I really want to protect my team against board wipes, so we bring in another Sliver Hivelord. The problem with bringing in another 5-drop is we probably need to trim the Psionic Sliver because we can't have too many 5-drops and we need to empty our hand reasonably quick. We also take out the Mesmeric Sliver, again to reduce the CMC of most of our slivers, and also, if we get the Sliver Hivelord down as well as the Telekinetic Sliver, I'm pretty confident we can't lose the game no matter what our opponent top decks. I trim a Kira in place of a Frenetic Sliver. Whilst Kira is much better at single target removal, a Frenetic Sliver deals with board wipes like Anger of the Gods a lot better than Kira does. We also bring in a Homing Sliver because this is very much a matchup where finding that Sliver Hivelord and a Telekinetic Sliver is absolutely vital. It's going to be hard for us to lose if we can find those pieces. So the Homing Sliver allows us very much to tutor up those 2 cards we need. We also bring in 1 extra Dark Heart Sliver. I think if we can get the lock down, the only way we can realistically lose is to burn damage. So I'm trying to mitigate some of the burn damage we can take from stuff like Lightning Bolts by just having some Dark Heart Slivers to sacrifice some of the non-important slivers going later into the game. Finally, I bring in 2 Ensnaring Bridges for the 2 Nissas, 2 non-sliver spells for 2 non-sliver spells. We keep an opening hand that has a huge amount of potential. We've got a couple of lands, we've got the Telekinetic Sliver, and we have the Frenetic Sliver to protect our creatures. We need to find more lands and a Sliver Hivelord, but with the Ensnaring Bridge in hand as well, I think this is a decent start for us. Our opponent plays an Oath of Nissa and they find themselves a Scooze. A Scooze is actually not that good against us unless they can kill our creatures. We top deck the Chord of Calling, so now all we need to do is protect our slivers and get enough of them down so we can Chord of Calling for the Sliver Hivelord and life might be good. Our opponent fetches with Wooded Foothills, they play their Scavenging Ooze and pass back to us. We get ourselves a Breeding Pool, we say no to the 2 points of damage, I'm finally learning, and we top deck a Cavern of Souls. We put down the Sliver Hive, and I decide to lead with the Dark Heart Sliver since if our opponent does have removal, that's the one creature I really don't care about. And wouldn't you know it, our opponent has a Skred. We gain 3 life in the Dark Heart Sliver, and our opponent chomps it up with the Scavenging Ooze. Whilst not being ideal that our opponent had a Skred in hand, we essentially don't care about the Dark Heart Sliver, and it's tapped our opponent out of mana for the turn. They get in for the 3 points of damage, we're essentially back to where we started the turn at. We find another Cavern of Souls off the top, and we've been pretty fortunate to find all of these pieces that we have. We cast our Frenetic Sliver, our opponent goes into the north yet again. They get in with Scavenging Ooze, and we decide to not block. We top deck into a Birds of Paradise, which is actually a fantastic draw, because now we can play the Dormant Sliver, and then we have the mana available soon to Chord of Calling for our Sliver Hive Lord, and it feels like if our opponent doesn't have removal in hand, we almost have this game locked already. The Dormant Sliver enters the battlefield, we draw a Magic the Gathering card, we find another Ensnaring Bridge. Meaning now, for our opponent to kill us, they need to have board wipe before Sliver Hive Lord comes down, as well as have 2 pieces of Artifact Destruction so that they can attack with their creatures. Our opponent plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and casts himself a Koth of the Hammer. Now that is a slight worry. We don't have many pieces on the board that can deal with Koth right now. Our opponent animates their mountain and then gets in for 4 points of damage. We decline to block. We top deck an island, we put it down, and I decide to go ahead and cast a Telekinetic Sliver. We tap down the Telekinetic Sliver with our Dormant Sliver, and since Koth is reasonably close to ultimating already, I decide to just gamble on the Dormant Sliver in the hope that it survives. We actually won the flip, so we get the Dormant Sliver back on end step, and we can now attack Koth for 2 points with our Frenetic Sliver. Now we have emptied our hand quite a huge amount. We've been kind of forced into that situation thanks to the Koth. We're hoping our opponent doesn't have too much removal, because next turn we can play the Chord of Calling and get down our Sliver Hive Lord, which will not necessarily guarantee the win since they do have Planeswalkers, but it's very, very likely we will be able to take over the game at that point. Our opponent animates a mountain, and then they lightning bolt the Frenetic Sliver. We win the coin flip, but unfortunately our opponent follows up with a Chandra Torch of Defiance and takes down our Telekinetic Sliver. The Frenetic Sliver comes back on end step, we draw a card, which is yet again another land. We untap and we find yet again another bloody land. We cast our Birds of Paradise, yet again a free spell in the face of a Chord of Calling, and we tutor up the Sliver Hive Lord. We draw a card from the Sliver Hive Lord ETB via the Dormant Sliver, and we find a Telekinetic Sliver. Things really are starting to heat up here for us. The problem is they tick up with Chandra and they have an Ensnaring Bridge. I think our opponent played the old switcheroo on us and turned themselves into a prison-y kind of Planeswalker deck, which makes our 2 Ensnaring Bridges in hand look kind of embarrassing. We top deck a second Dormant Sliver, which is very nice as far as card draw goes. We play our Telekinetic Sliver, we top deck a Manaweth Sliver. We cast a Manaweth Sliver, we draw a Sliver High. At this point, I believe our out is a Necrotic Sliver. If we can find that, our opponent probably loses the game on the spot, because we have so much mana at this point of the game. We tap down their Scavenging Ooze, we flip the coin on our Dormant Sliver, and we get in for 2 points of damage at Koth of the Hammer, meaning that we have plenty of turns now to find the pieces we need to take over the game. Chandra ticks up and reveals an Oath of Nissa, which is going to deal 2 points of damage to us. Our opponent opts to not cast it. They follow up with a Bloodbraid Elf, which doesn't seem that great with his current board. However, it does reveal a Lightning Bolt, which deals 3 points of damage to our face. Our opponent then casts a second Lightning Bolt from their hand, and all of a sudden, we are down to just 3 life. And from here, the rest of the game is like a clown fiesta. We draw yet another fucking land. We cast our Dormant Sliver, which draws us into a Gale Rider Sliver. We cast the Gale Rider Sliver, which draws us into a Diffusion Sliver. We cast the Diffusion Sliver, which draws us into a Frenetic Sliver. I tap down our opponent's Bloodbraid Elf with the hope of getting in with our Slivers and taking out their Planeswalkers. Unfortunately, because I'm a fucking dumbass for the 19 millionth time this match, I forget to blink the Dormant Sliver before combat, and we cannot attack. Our opponent cast a Bloodbraid Elf, and for some unknown reason, they decide not to cast the Blood Moon, despite the fact we have a Sliver Hive on the field. And then to really round off this clown fiesta of magic for the last couple of turns, our opponent ticks up on Chandra, and then goes Anger of the Gods to kill our Birds of Paradise and take out 2 of their own creatures. I guess it does get them down to just 1 card in hand, so it means that they can't lose their Planeswalkers next turn, but it just seems like bad sequencing to not go Bloodbraid Elf after the Anger of the Gods. We top deck yet another bloody land, we play our Frenetic Sliver, and we find a Sliver Hive Lord. Knowing that we really have to find that Necrotic Sliver right now, I make a Sliver token using our Sliver Hive. Yet again, our opponent's decision to not cast a Blood Moon, a rather puzzling choice last turn, might lose them the game. We find a Gale Rider Sliver, and it's getting a bit tight now. We do need to find that last piece we need. We flip the coin on our dormant Sliver and we lose the coin toss. That's not really that relevant. We swing in at Chandra to put her down to a measly 1 point of life. We cast our Gale Rider Sliver, which I probably should have cast before I flipped the dormant Sliver. Our opponent casts a Storm Breath Dragon, and then they use Chandra and Koth to make themselves a Blood Moon. And with that, there is no more attacking for us. And with Storm Breath Dragon able to monster us next turn, we have to find the Necrotic Sliver, otherwise we are dead. Jesus fucking Christ. We cast the Necrotic Sliver, and we are able to take out almost every relevant permanent on the field, and our opponent concedes the match. Now this is a matchup against Blue-White Control, otherwise known as Boring White Control, because the aim of that deck is to bore your opponents to death. Now, I'm not going to go too much into depth in this matchup because this was a test matchup, as I said previously. However, what I will talk about is some of the changes I did make. You can see in my hand right now there is an Eldritch Evolution, and the reason I took this out of the deck is quite often I didn't want to sacrifice a Sliver, even though I was upgrading a Sliver, I just didn't think it was really worth it. We're technically 2-for-1ing ourselves just to get the pieces we need, and we have enough of Chord of Callings and Homeland Slivers that it just didn't really feel worth it. We also had more telekinetic Slivers in the deck, and it kind of made it a bit more clunky. This is why I came to the epiphany that we needed to have a lower mana curve with more Slivers in the deck, and not all of these Eldritch Evolutions and over-the-top telekinetic Slivers. Now in this matchup, I actually thought it would be a bad matchup for this deck, but thanks to the Cavern of Souls, it's actually not that bad. You can see here, a Kira comes down, and our opponent never really gets in a position where they can do anything against us. Now, much like against Tron, if we can get our Slivers down and tap our opponent's lands on upkeep, a lot of their deck is actually sorcery speed. You think about stuff like Serum Visions, the Board Wipes, even the Terminus. If they want to cast it, they can only do it on their draw step or cast it main phase. Even things like being able to only cast your Cryptic Command on your upkeep, even if you bounce a Sliver back to our hand, it means that they don't have the mana to counter it on the way back down. So this really does feel like a snowbally kind of effect. Once we get the Blue-White Control deck on the back foot, there's not really much they can do outside of find double Path to Exile to work their way through the Kira triggers. As you can see here, our opponent does manage to counter our Nissa, but then we eventually draw into a Chord of Calling, which gets us the pieces we need. Our opponent taps out for a Snapcaster Mage into opt on end step. We take our chances by Chord of Calling into a telekinetic Sliver, and we say to our opponent, look, here is your chance. If you have a board wipe, you probably win. If you don't have a board wipe, we're going to take over this game going forward. So our opponent casts a Baneslayer Angel, and that is pretty much going to be the game. You'll also note that, as has always happened with Eldritch Evolution, we don't really want to sacrifice a Sliver at the minute because we have the lock set up, and there's not really anything we can do with this card. Also, the Mesmeric Sliver we drew into kind of hasn't been as good as I thought it would be. We have to have a Sliver enter the battlefield before we can Fate Seal, and it feels like this is kind of a bit win more. There may be occasions where we need to see the top card of our opponent's library to make sure they can't find the pieces they need, but more often than not, it was kind of underwhelming. We get ourselves in a position where we keep tapping down our opponent's stuff, getting in with Kira, chipping away for points of damage, and the plan being that when we're ready, we will tap down the creatures and attack for lethal with all of our Slivers. Unfortunately, our opponent keeps hitting their land drops, and we don't really hit enough Slivers to keep tapping down the lands. However, despite all of this, I managed to find myself in a position where our opponent tries to Cryptic Command our team to tap them all, and I have a Chord of Calling. Problem is, my target was the Psionic Sliver, which is a 5-drop, and I Chord for 4. Basically gives the opponent an absurd amount of extra turns, because that was meant to be our win condition to end the game. I reluctantly go for the Dormant Sliver since it's going to draw us a whole bunch of cards. I would much rather have that 5-drop and win the game right now, but unfortunately, I'm a complete dumbass. At least Dormant Sliver will allow us to draw a whole bunch of cards going forward. This also leaves us open to a potential board wipe. If our opponent has it in hand, we lose all of our Slivers now, and that will probably just be game. Luckily for us, our opponent doesn't have the board wipe, and we survive yet another turn. Our opponent keeps using Snapcaster Mage's Cryptic Commands to tap our team so we can never tap their lands on upkeep, and kind of fortunately for us, they never find a board wipe, but we are making a Sliver token every turn so that we can make sure the top card of the library isn't a board wipe. Also, as fortunate as we are getting that our opponent doesn't have a board wipe, in reality, if I hadn't have misclicked my mana for the Chord of Calling, my opponent would already be dead. We finally get into a position where our opponent taps down our team with a Cryptic Command one final time. We check the top card of their library, it is a land. We use an Eldritch Evolution to get the Psionic Sliver we should have got earlier, and our opponent has to find a board wipe right now, otherwise they die next turn. And thanks to Fate Seal, we know there is a land on top of their library. Unfortunately, I forgot about the Baneslayer Angel, which means they can gain 5 life, and we only have 8 slivers on the field. However, it's not that big of a deal. We get to, again, create a sliver token, at least one every turn, so we can Fate Seal our opponent, and it's just a matter of time until we can deal with either the Baneslayer Angel, or just deal all of that damage to our opponent's face. Our opponent uses the little mana they have to cast a Jace the Mind Sculptor, which won't really do anything. We have enough damage on board now to kill our opponent next turn. We can make Sliver tokens on end step, which will be sacrificed to deal 2 points to our opponent's face. We can tap down the Baneslayer Angel so they're not going to gain any more life this turn. And that's exactly what happens. So you end up winning game 1. It took way longer than it should have done, and as we skip forward towards the end of game 2 here, the mistake in game 1 actually lost me the match because we have, as we can see here, our opponent fully locked. There's nothing they can do. We have the Psionic Sliver in our hand, and we need literally a couple of minutes to end the game by dealing all of those points of damage to our opponent's face. Unfortunately, as you see here, we're left with 43 seconds, which is nowhere near enough time, and our opponent's going to win the match, but in reality, we basically won 2-0, and if it wasn't for me misplaying, we definitely would have won this match easily. So that was our something different for this week, and that was Sliver Prison. Overall, I actually really enjoyed the deck. It's a really, really fun deck to play, and it's actually quite hard. It's really weird saying that, but it's a reasonably hard deck to play. One thing you guys didn't see in these matchups is when we played against aggro decks that I played later on a different day, you kind of get overrun and you never get time to set up. So maybe we could make some adjustments in the sideboard to better deal with aggro decks. It feels like the slower, dirtlier decks, I guess you couldn't really put Tron in the dirtlier deck kind of area, but decks that don't interact a huge amount outside of sorcery speed spells are very, very much an easy matchup for this deck. So if we can deal with somewhat of the aggro decks, we might have a chance of actually having a genuinely decent prison deck on our hands. A suggestion that somebody came to me with afterwards is we could probably put a Sliver Legion into the main deck as something else that we could tutor up with our Chord of Callings, and then that way we can quite easily swing in one turn and kill our opponents. So definitely should have included Sliver Legion within the 75 at least, and probably the main 60. We went 2-1 in the actual games we saw. Blue-White Control wasn't the actual deck we were playing in the end, but again, I do have to count that as a loss, even though we probably would have won had the game have gone on for an extra minute or two. And it's not really that surprising. I think the deck is a perfectly reasonable deck to play. It's quite consistent, and if you can get your hand empty quick enough, you can actually just stop your opponents from casting any spells. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the content here today. You can help me out by subscribing down below, giving me a like, and telling me down below what do you think of this deck, and would you ever take it to something like an F&M? Thank you guys for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.